This is not really a rehearsed thing, probably ramble a little bit, but there was something I saw recently. It's like a week ago, maybe a couple days. Kind of, yes, not really sure when. Vacation started, so my comprehension of time passing is a little bit skewed when there's no work. But anyway, there was a month or two ago, there was a big stink about online streaming of role-playing games. About somebody was complaining about there is no D&D community, and that you're either a gamer because you play the game, or you're just not or you're not anything. You're maybe a consumer, and that's it. There was some very exclusionary language, that arbitrarily exclusionary at that. But recently, apparently, there was, on one of the Discords I'm part of, somebody talking about a release by a game company that included a statement along the lines of claiming that online streaming demystifies role-playing games. And there was a couple more sentences afterwards about complaining about how they were whistleblowing towards the people that dislike the online streaming. I didn't really think much of it at the time. I didn't take part in that conversation. It lasted for about 3 lines before somebody changed the subject, because it had occurred well after the actual crisis was done. I didn't take part in the conversation too much, but it's been occurring to me that the statement that online streaming demystifies role-playing games is a true statement, but it is phrased in a way to have a negative connotation. When you demystify something, you remove levels of obscurity, you bring it up to light, you make it obvious, you make it clear. The use of the word demystify has a negative connotation. It's getting this idea that you're removing something special from the thing by revealing it for what it was, which I think is a incredibly short-sighted philosophy, really. If the truth of the subject isn't interesting, then the mystery, if the interest of the object is only in its mystery, then it's not really interesting. Now, the practice of uncovering a mystery is an interesting pastime in itself, but again, once you've uncovered the mystery, it's not really interesting. Now, the only reason you would find the mystique of it as a positive is if you enjoy being in on something that other people haven't figured out yet. It's a kind of elitist attitude, really, in that word choice. And it goes in along with the idea of gatekeepers, where people trying to control who is involved in a particular hobby or not. And yes, online streaming completely demystifies role-playing games, and that is a good thing. Role-playing games, gaming in general, when you go to your friends, sit down at a table and play games, serves the same social function as any other social pastime. Like if somebody goes to every week to have a poker night with their friends, if somebody watches a big sports game at the end of the week every time, if somebody goes bird watching with people for some reason, go play miniature golf, go watch a movie with a bunch of friends, go paintballing, go camping. Any of these are social, a lot of these are social things that you do with other people. And they serve the same function. They are a shared interest that gives an excuse for people to get together and do something. Go to a party. Let's go to a party and get together and go to a party. Let's get together and over lunch and all that. It serves as a excuse for coming together. It also provides a little bit of whimsy, and whimsy is an important part of mental health. The particular flavor of whimsy we like depends from person to person. A broadly socially acceptable form of whimsy that exists is sports. People can geek out about sports almost as much as they like, and most people won't bat an eye because sports is a socially acceptable hobby. Watching it is a socially acceptable hobby. It's supposed to be healthy and all that. But it's no different than geeking out over the stats and who's the top players in football is no different than geeking out over, let's say, the new releases in D&D, or something else like the new game, like a new game with the new system coming out that sounds very interesting in role-playing games, or on the video game type stuff. There's no difference. Or somebody geeking out over the different types of rare birds that exist. Nobody's really wired the same way. We have this myth that everybody that there is a normal brain wiring, that there is a normal psychology, and it just really doesn't exist. The person sitting next to you is going to be wired really differently from you, even if it's not immediately obvious. The differences might not be in things you see every day. But anyway, it's a digression. Now, you try to explain the hobby to people, and this will happen with any hobby, but I'm going to focus on role-playing games. You try to explain the hobby to people who are not involved. It's like you start saying things like, well, you make a character on this piece of paper by spending these points and stuff like that, and then you roll these dice and you count up how many of them are more than this number, or whatever other system you're doing. I'm doing a lot of Scion recently, so I've got a lot of the story path, the D10s and counting successes in head right now. But a lot of you get into the nitty gritty, the mechanics, and a lot of people will kind of get a little bit blank. If you start going into the passion, into why you love it so much, this will especially happen when somebody says, I don't really get it, and there's this reaction where you get defensive, and you will start getting into the emotional reasons why you enjoy something, and that can come across rather aggressive. So when somebody doesn't see it for themselves, the way you can see sports all the time, the way you can see people walking around bird watching, the way you can see people playing golf, the way you can see people doing the parties, all that, then they're not going to understand it, and they're going to be a little bit wary of it, because when someone realizes they don't understand it, they might get aggressive or dismissive in their responses, depending on whether they have a "you must do this, it's so awesome" attitude, or a elitist is like, well, you're not worthy this isn't for you. You obviously aren't capable of understanding this, so it's obviously not for you. Go away, peasant. There's other attitudes besides that, but those are two of the bigger ones that are going to be that people are going to be responding to more often, and that will scare people away. That will scare people away, where they don't understand it, and it seems like the people involved are a little bit over-involved. Now, the thing is, you get the same responses in the same widening scale as in any hobby. And you'll have the same responses from the people that really don't understand, but we can point to it and say, well, we'll go to the party and you'll see. Well, come to the party with me, you'll have fun, see? And either you will have fun, and it's like, okay, I'll do another party, or you won't have fun. It's like, nah, I think I'll stay home. I don't really like parties. D&D and other games are the same way. But because it's not something we usually see, it's hard to understand. Up until shows like Critical Role, and Critical Role is not the first online streaming thing that existed. Knights of the Night as a podcast, they don't do videos. Knights of the Night is like 2, 3, maybe 4 years older than Critical Role is. They're a smaller group. They do it as hobbyists. I think it sounds like it's a family, mostly a family group that's been role playing for years. Critical Role just happened to be this nice intersection between celebrities who have the hobby and have an opportunity to put it on on video with a company that was appealing to geek audiences. So it was just this nice little crossroads of lucky confluence of events that produce boom, Critical Role, and suddenly the hobby is booming. And what Critical Role does, because before Critical Role, the examples we had for D&D were short little snippets in different TV shows where you couldn't possibly get a good view of what goes on in a D&D session in a 30-minute episode where the D&D only happens for maybe 5 minutes and everything else is talking about the D&D and jokes about the D&D. So that was a lucky confluence of events that had Critical Role explode the way it did. But now that Critical Role has been on, and now that these other shows are on, you can actually see people doing the hobby, and you can see what it is that happens at these people's houses. So when someone's saying, well, what do you do? What is this hobby? It's not a matter of saying, well, I do this, I do this, I do this. It's like, well, you know what? I can pull up an episode of this show and you can watch it with me and you'll see this is the kind of the way the hobby works. And there are versions of these shows for a lot of different games. Like I said, there's Knights of the Night. There's Dice Heroes. There's Adventure Zone, Critical Role, We're Alive Frontier, Sagas of Sundry, Shield of Tomorrow, Eric's TBD RPG, the Rich Rogers, the Gauntlet podcasts, the Jank Cast. There are so many different actual play podcasts out there, and actual play streamings. Maze Arcana, Pencils and Parsecs for Star Wars role playing, Hyper RPG. So many different things out there that are doing this now. You can find a streaming of practically any game system that you want to display to someone, say this is how the game is played. And that makes it much more accessible, which means potential newcomers to the hobby are going to be scared off much less. And I suppose from a mindset that some people would think that this is a bad thing because it's going to dilute the hobby from the people who just love it because of it, and bring in a bunch of people who are just here because now it's popular and it's a fad. And that is one of the most mind-boggling arguments for anything I've ever heard. And because more people enjoying your hobby is a good thing. It means the hobby has more money in it, and the people doing the hobby have more freedom. One of the things where you had before the hobby started exploding because of all the streaming and people learning what was really going on and saying, oh, that looks like fun, I'll do that, is that you would have very limited choice in a gaming group. So you could get an abusive GM, but they are the only GM you know about, so you have to stay with the abusive GM and the group that doesn't really like you, or even worse, likes to actively harass you because they don't want you in your group, but they're going to make it a trouble for you. Which is another thing. If you don't want somebody in your group, why would you keep them in your group? And that's another thing that came from the limited things. There was a limited pool of players. There's a limited pool of GMs. Sure, there might be tons of them, but finding them was really hard. Having played since the 80s, I know this. And you end up playing with people that you don't really like because of this issue. And what the gaming, broadening the hobby does is makes it to where there's more opportunity to play with broader selection of people. And what this means is that people who may be slightly abusive in their gameplays find themselves without a group. And so this is a bad thing for them. Especially when you can play online as well as watch online things. You don't have to play with the people in your city or your neighborhood. You can play with somebody in another country. Just work out the scheduling. And you hear the term gatekeeper for people that try to keep undesirables out of their hobby, to find a particular turn of phrase. And excuse me, I much prefer the idea of gate building, because the gaming hobby used to be like a hidden valley in the midst of a bunch of mountains, or through a dense weave of trees and of impenetrable forest with no paths. You didn't know which games were good. There were tons, and there weren't as many games as there were now. And so on the one hand, there was less choice, but on the other hand, it was harder to find the game that was right for you, because you couldn't see examples of it being played. You couldn't get. It was really expensive. You were limited by whatever supplies your local gaming store or bookstore had. You were limited by what games people in your area wanted to play. You were limited by trying to find the people in your area that wanted to play at all. These were all extreme limits. So it's one of the reasons why D&D was so popular, is because everybody knew D&D, because it was one of the first games that got really popular in the late 70s, early 80s. And there were other games. It wasn't the first role-playing game, but it was the first big one. Big being relative. At the time, D&D was about as big in the 70s and 80s as Fate is now, or Powered by the Apocalypse is now. Whereas D&D now is getting on the verge of being a mainstream hobby. So they've been courting that goal for a long time now. And a lot of people think that's a bad thing. So yeah, it used to be that the gaming hobby was this really hard to find mystical location that you heard about, but it was hard to get into because the opportunities were so limited. When the internet started and you started getting play by post and play by email, and then play by text chat and play by voice chat, it started broadening about that. That opened a gate that made it possible for people to find games that they wouldn't be able to find in their area. And then streaming happened, and that's opened another gate. That it has removed the veil of what exactly is this all about, and replaced it with being able to actually show people what goes on and let them decide, that looks fun, or I don't get it. And instead of pushing away people that would be potentially great players. And as to the complaint about, well, if you don't play the game, you're not part of the community. Sorry, no. There has always been an audience. There have always been people who enjoy watching us play. One of the first campaigns the first campaign I was ever involved with was a superhero campaign, Champions First Edition. It involved my younger brother and my younger sister, and was run by my oldest brother. And my sister had fun, but she didn't really like playing. She liked watching us play. And she has always been more of an audience. She likes watching Critical Role, but she doesn't play D&D. She doesn't play much video games either, a little bit here and there. But yeah, there has always been an audience. There has always been that parent that likes listening to us play our games in the room and having fun. There has always been the friend that watches but doesn't really take part because they're not really interested in playing. But they like listening to the story. There has always been an audience, and they have always contributed. Like my sister has always has provided would provide her share of drinks whenever she would come to watch us game. Sodas or candies or whatever food supplies she would bring along. The parents always allowed us the space to use rooms in the house and provide us the snacks. The friends would always come along. Sometimes you would get the artist friends who would love listening to the story and make the art for you. Yeah, sure, they didn't play, but they got involved. The audience has always been involved. The audience has always been there. But the audience now is so much larger than it used to be. And it's easier. And there is audience everywhere. And there are a lot of people who will enjoy watching a pastime that they do not enjoy doing. And if you don't believe me on that, then tell me where the millions of dollars in the football industry come from. Because the majority of those people who are interested in various sports don't actually play the sports. They just watch. So the audience has always been there. The audience has always been part of the community. The audience has always contributed. The audience has always introduced other people to the hobby and brought them in. Because my sister might not play, but she might meet somebody who is she tells about, and they might sound interested and come and start playing. The audience is a benefit. The audience is part of the community. There is a community. It's not just the people playing the game. And that's a good thing. It's a wonderful thing. It's bringing people together. I mean, again, this is no different than football. This is no different than opera. This is no different from bird watching. They all bring people together. So all of these hobbies bring people together to talk about the hobbies. And whether they're a casual observer of the hobby or an active participant, they are involved, and it brings them together, and it is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And the more gates we can build to make it easier to get into the hobby or to take part in the community, the better. Thank you.